Dear God, we love you, and we are thankful to be here this morning. We're thankful for times together. We're thankful for times we can open up our Bible and study and see and just the truths it holds and the wisdom it has for our lives, where we can see how much you love us and how much you care for us, and where we can glean wisdom from it. Lord, we just ask that you watch over us this morning. Be with us as we study. In your name we pray. Amen. All right. To recap, last week, David was in Acts 16. He talked about Paul and Silas escaping from prison. He talked about a central question: what must I do to be saved? And so as we kind of look at Acts 17 this week, if we had to come up with a question, it might be, who or what do I worship? Who or what do I worship? At the beginning of chapter 17, we're going to find Paul and Silas and Timothy in Thessalonica. They've made it to Thessalonica after all the stuff that's gone on, and Paul does what he usually does when he enters a city. He heads straight to the synagogue and he begins to tell people about Jesus. And this seems to go pretty well until it doesn't, right? He's there for a couple weeks, maybe 2 or 3 weeks. A number of people, both Jews and Gentiles, are listening. They're hearing. Some of them are beginning to believe the good news. But some Jews get jealous. They round up a mob. They grab their pitchforks and their torches, right? And they start a riot. They even ransack Jason's house looking for Paul. They run to Jason's house. They're looking for Paul and Silas and Timothy, and they're trying to find them. They end up dragging Jason and his family. When they don't find Paul, Jason and some other brothers into court and accuse Paul of bowing to another king, which is kind of true, just out of context, right? And the mob just continues to be thrown into a frenzy. They make Jason post bond and kind of harass him a little bit, and then they let him go. And as soon as Jason gets home that night, he tells Paul and Silas, he's like, man, y'all got to get out of here. So he sends them on to Berea for their own safety. And as soon as Paul and the others arrive in Berea, Paul does what he always does. He heads to the synagogue because Paul is relentless, right? He's just been hunted by an angry mob for preaching in the synagogue. His friends have been harassed. He's had to escape by the cover of night. You'd think he might want to lay low for a little bit, right? Stay out of sight, but not Paul. He heads into the next synagogue he sees and continues to tell people all about Jesus. That convicts me a little bit because I think about just how little it takes for me to close my mouth or shrink back. How easy it is for me to not take hold of the opportunities to tell people all about Jesus. I can come up with a bunch of excuses. But Paul just keeps telling people no matter what. And in Berea, while he's there, he finds the people there to be a little better at accepting the word, hearing the word. They're a little more welcoming, a little more open to the message. Many people begin to believe, Jews, Gentiles, right? They're all believing. And things are going really well until they don't. Because the mob from Thessalonica hears, oh, Paul's now in Berea and he's preaching again. We got to do something about this. And so they decide to take a little trip. And I think it's important to note that it's not just a little trip, because they can't just hop in their Hyundai and go drive the 50 miles, right? It's about 50 miles from Thessalonica to Berea. So you're walking that with an angry mob. So they set out to go find him. So while Paul was relentless, so is this mob, right? They make it to Berea, the mob does, and they start up the same shenanigans that they were doing in Thessalonica, whipping up a frenzy, stirring the pot, getting people upset. And immediately in Berea, they say, Paul, you got to get out of here. And so he's sent to the coast. Silas and Timothy, they stay behind in Berea. And looking at these first couple stories, we're not going to read all of those. I just wanted to kind of give you the summary of what's going on. We're going to make it to the end of I really want to focus on Athens this morning. But looking at those first two stories, we see that Paul is relentless, and we're inspired to be a little more relentless. He understands that setbacks are going to be part of the gig, right? He's facing his fair share, but he embraces it and knows who goes into those with him. And I want to imitate Paul, and I want to be a little more relentless. And then I'm reminded that our enemy, much like the mob, is also relentless. The devil is prowling around like a roaring lion, looking to devour. He's definitely up to making a 50-mile trek if that's what it's going to take to destroy. He looks constantly to upset the calm in our life. He throws us stuff in hopes the chaos will make us question, or preoccupy us from the mission, or steal our joy. But I just want to remind you that the Lord of Lords is on our side. So we continue to be like Paul. We continue to preach. We continue to serve. We continue to pursue God. Whatever setbacks or hardships come our way, the great news that you know is worth sharing, no matter the cost. So be relentless, not only in your pursuit of God, but in telling his story the same way Paul was, time after time after time. Paul does make it safely to Athens and asks that Silas and Timothy join him as quick as possible, right? So he finds himself alone in Athens, waiting for his friends. He's kind of taking in the city, seeing the sights. And when he was in Athens, he would have seen that Athens was a center of art and literature and philosophy of the time. A cultured place. All the new ideas came through Athens. A place doing pretty well when you look at it from the outside. The Google AI summary, I asked Google what was Athens like in the first century, and this is what they said. So thank you, Google AI. Athens was a powerful city-state in ancient Greece that was a center of democracy, the arts, education, and philosophy. In the first century, Athens was still economically vibrant with new buildings, statues, and tombs. It's kind of an interesting thing to throw in there, being constructed. The Romans valued Athens' cultural heritage and classical Greek values and promoted them as moral standards. So thank you, Google AI, for that. But that sounds really familiar. That sounds a little bit like home. A wealthy, flourishing place, lots of competing ideas and philosophies, and idols. Paul looks around, and amidst all the big city things, verse 16 tells us, chapter 17, verse 16 tells us, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. Paul begins to be distressed by what he sees. Everywhere he looks, there are idols. Places of worship for the Athenian people. Gods for this, goddesses for that, shrines over here, altars over there. Athens is sounding a little more like home every second. We may not have idols on every corner, or altars on every corner, or temples built to a myriad of gods, right? We may keep our idols a little closer than that. Nearer than a temple in a city or a shrine down the road. I want you to take just a second and consider our favorite idols of the day, because we don't have shrines set up. There's no Zeus, but we do have the almighty dollar. How many of us pursue wealth and a comfortable lifestyle to an extreme degree? How many of us make work and moving up the corporate ladder our ultimate goal? We don't have Athena, but we do have the desire for fame, to be known, to have status, followers, and approval, to be somebody in the world and to the world. Man, how many of us chase after that to an unhealthy degree? There is no Poseidon, but we do have technology, which is not a bad thing in and of itself. Thanks, Google AI, right? But we can sure decide to spend our time and our days staring at screens and losing ourselves in virtual worlds, focusing all of our attention on the dancing pixels in front of us, right? We don't have Hermes or Dionysus, but we do have shopping and food and self-indulgence and working out and relationships and sex and talents and hobbies and beauty and youth and kids and our kids' sports and on and on and on, and it'd be a pretty extensive list. And in the Athens that we live in, we place a really high importance on a lot of these things. And it may be that we don't really want to call these idols, or it may be that we don't really recognize them as such, because really, some of them are, like I said, pretty nice and useful, and initially they don't start out as an idol for us. I mean, the list I gave you, we have to work. It's hard to make it without money. Got to eat, right? God gave us talents to use. He wants us to take care of ourselves and be happy, right? So, things don't seem bad in and of themselves, but here's the catch. Over time, if we're not careful, these things have a way of moving up the ladder of our priorities until they've reached this kind of godlike status in our life, until they reach the pinnacle of importance. And when that happens, they've taken the spot reserved for someone else. The devil, he's pretty crafty. Genesis tells us that he's more crafty than any of the wild animals, which sounds pretty crafty. And while outright idol worship is not on trend for the moment, like I said, we don't walk around and see a bunch of statues and idols that we worship. Our enemy has tricked us into wrapping our idols into our normal life. He has helped us make good and normal things into our ultimate things. Objects of worship that we chase after at all costs. The things that consume the majority of our thoughts, our time, our energy. So if you don't think that's happened, if you're like, man, this doesn't really even apply to me, an easy litmus test to kind of see, man, is this me, right? There's a new book that came out not long ago called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. It's great. I would highly recommend it. Great. It's a great read. But one of the things that the author says is we worry about what we worship. Worry about what we worship. So if you need a good barometer to let you know if something has crept too far up your idol spectrum, right? You can ask yourself, how much time and thought and worry do I give this thing? And on the other side of the coin, we can also ask, how much do I worry about God and living His way? And we might also get an answer about what we truly worship. It's not a fun test. It is kind of, this week as I've studied, it's kind of stepped on my toes a bit as I've thought about it. I'd rather talk about a million other things than peer into my own junk and see what I've been bowing down to. Paul looks at Athens and is distressed by what he sees. Man, I look into my own life, I look into the world I inhabit, and I'm not sure that I get too distressed, that I let it bother me. Usually I'm pretty apathetic, or I justify, or I make excuses about the idols that I have. Maybe we can be a bit more like Paul and be distressed by the idols we see in our own life and in the world around us. So, distressed by the idols he sees around him. He does what he always does. He heads to the synagogue. Paul does that day. And he begins to tell people about Jesus. He leads people to the one he knows has the answer to what they're really seeking. He's recently been imprisoned. He's been run out of the last two towns. But again, because he is relentless, his love of others and of God drives him to action. And people are listening. Jews and Greeks, they're listening. They're curious. They're asking questions. He's telling them all about Jesus and the resurrection. And we live in a world where there are hungry people searching, hungry for something real, something with meaning. We live in a world that's searching for something worthy to worship. And we have the answer, same as Paul did, and we got to share it the same as Paul did. And Paul is sharing, right? So some philosophers begin to question him and argue with him, and so they get Paul to go to Mars Hill. They get him to go to the Areopagus, a place where legal matters and debates happened, a place where civil affairs were talked about. And so when because people of that day loved their information, which kind of sounds a lot like our world. If you look at verse 21, it says, I just think this is a funny verse. It says, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about listening to the latest ideas. That's how they spent their time. We live in a world where information, both good information, bad information, true information, false information, helpful info, unhelpful info, is all just a click away. We carry around so much information just in our pocket. I don't actually like that about our current world too much because the days of ballparking answers are gone. Used to could say something like, hey, how many home runs did Babe Ruth hit? And you could kind of just ballpark it. I think it's about 700. And immediately one of your friends is going to go, and they're going to look at Google and they're going to say, it was 714, and they're going to correct you. So you can never just ballpark anything anymore. Because we have the info and we have the ability to be right and to know things, right? And we have this sea of information and these competing ideas and competing philosophies that are limitless, this limitless amount of info. No shortage of opinions, suggestions, facts, and criticisms, and all that as well. All of that to say, I think that we could identify well with Athens. I think we would have fit in pretty good. They craved info, so do we. So at the council's request, Paul is asked to tell these people what he's been teaching in the synagogue. And I love that Paul meets these people where they are. He is kind, and I've heard many lessons on how skilled he was to take something they were familiar with and teach them about Jesus. He looks and he says, right, I've seen your statue, not the tomb of the unknown soldier, seen your statue to the unknown God, right, this idol to the unknown God. Let me tell you about him. So it's really cool that he takes this and tells them about it. He even quotes their own literature to them. It's kind of this great master class of being able to tell somebody about Jesus without, just stomping all over their beliefs or stomping all over someone else in the process. And that's a great kind of takeaway from this chapter. But I really want to look at it from a different angle today, because Paul stands up in a world full of known gods, and his first sentence is telling. I can see that you are religious. If you look at verse 22, it says, Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Now what you worship is something unknown. I'm going to proclaim to you. Paul looks and says, see, you've got a bunch of gods. See, you worship a bunch of people, bunch of deities. Man, I think if Paul was here, he would look at us. Like I said, our gods may not be statues, but I think he'd look and go, I see you worship a bunch of stuff. In Athens, Paul directs the attention of the people to their own statue, right? He then introduces the audience to their unknown God. And here's maybe the big twist, and I hope, and what I think is maybe so interesting about Paul that day in Athens. It's kind of this bizarro world to our world today, or this kind of ironic twist. Because Athens was similar to us, but here's the difference. Paul speaks to these people who are worshiping these gods that they know, right? And he tells them about the one true God that they do not know. And on the flip side of that, today we know the one true God. We are blessed to know the one true God. And then we seem unaware of, unfazed by, or indifferent to all the things that we're worshiping and allowing to crowd God out of our life. We let things crowd God out and these idols when we know who is supposed to hold the top spot. Our lists are all going to be a little different, but we all have a list. And Paul says to the Athenian people, let me introduce you to the God that you do not know. But we could probably also benefit from a reintroduction today. So I want you to listen as Paul tells these people all about the God that he serves and that we serve. I hope you hear his words this morning in verse 24. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. From one man he made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he determined the times set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each other. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by man's design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given us proof of this, he's given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead. Paul says a lot in just a couple sentences. He points to God being the creator of all things, God's supremacy over all things, our need to turn away from idols and repent and move our lives and reorient our lives back to him, and how it's all about Jesus. The cross, the resurrection, the empty tomb. It all points to him. The one verse that really sticks out to me in that is verse 27. It's on the front of your bulletin this morning. Reread it for you real quick. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each of us. And he is not far from us. He is near to us. He is close by. That's comforting because God can feel far away, especially when I've made him common, or especially when I'm chasing after a bunch of other things, or he is not number one in my life. But I want to let you know that no matter what you've done, where he is on your list, what idols you've set up, no matter what altars you've been bowing down at, no matter what's in your past, the moment that Jesus is concerned with, the moment that matters to him most is now. He is not far away. Cast your idols down, right? Let's lay down our false gods and draw near to the one who calls us kids. Got to reshuffle our priority list and put God back at the top. That day in Athens, you find out at the end that in verse 32, when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. A few men became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius and a member of the Areopagus, can't talk. Also a woman named Damaris and a number of others. And that day in Athens, some who listened to Paul sneered. Some bolted after hearing about him talk about crazy stuff like the resurrection of the dead, right? A few had questions, and a few believed, and they set their other gods aside. May we be able to do the same this morning. So if you need a take-home, a David Bennett-style take-home, here it is. Will we be relentless like Paul in the pursuit of God? No matter what shows up in our path, right? He faced some terrible things, but we see the dedication to his mission, and it's convicting. He is adamant to share the words of life with whoever will listen, no matter the cost, right? May we be the same. And then will we be responsive when we realize what normal things, often normal things, we have set up and allowed to become idols in our life? Can we lay them down? Will we choose that this morning? Guys, if you need anything today, I want you to know this is a place that loves you and cares about you. Our elders are here for you. We want to help. Maybe it's time to recognize or to reorganize your life and set some idols down, reshuffle priorities, put God back as number one. We want to pray with you and help you do that. Maybe you need help setting those idols down because they've got their hooks in you. We are here and want to walk alongside you in that journey. Maybe you've never chosen, right, the great gift of forgiveness and salvation that God offers freely. His grace and His mercy extend to us all, and the moment is now. Choose to accept the gift, put Christ on in baptism, and be made new. As Paul said to the Athenians, God is not far off. He is here this morning calling us to Him as we stand and